Welcome to this week's edition of Information Return Intelligence. My name is Jason Dinesen. This podcast is a fast moving weekly podcast that's all about 1099s, W-9s, 1042S, etc., etc. This week's episode is about the W-9, which we've talked about several times in other episodes, and there's this looming new W-9 that's out there, a new draft of the W-9, but that's not what we're going to talk about today. By the way, as of the airing of this episode on February 24th, that proposed W-9 is still in draft status. Obviously, we'll devote an entire episode to that whenever it's actually released for real. Today, what I wanted to talk about is single member LLCs and what taxpayer identification number they're supposed to put on the W-9. And this comes from a question that someone asked me on LinkedIn recently. And the setup to this is single member LLCs that are taxed as sole proprietors are supposed to give you the name and taxpayer identification number of the owner of the business. But a lot of times, those types of LLCs are giving you the owner's name and the LLC's EIN, which is wrong. And we're going to go through that. We'll talk about the current instructions to the W-9, what it says about that. The question that was asked of me was, it was an accounts payable professional who said, we deal with this all the time where people are giving us the wrong number. And we tell people, this number is wrong. You need to give us your social security number. And the response that so many of these vendors give is, well, I asked my accountant. And my accountant said I should give the LLC's EIN. And so the question that this AP professional asked me is, why are accountants saying this to people if it's wrong? I'm not going to go down the road of even really trying to answer that piece. I think what we'll do is we'll just say, what do the instructions show? Like, what is in the instructions to the W-9 on this subject? So let's get started. With all that buildup, let's get started. I like to use the building block approach when we talk about these things. So let's start with why we issue 1099s. We talked about this on last week's episode also. Why do we issue 1099s? Well, the reason is tax compliance. That's why the law, it's not just the IRS, but the law says we must issue 1099s because the recipient of your 1099, that goes in the IRS's computers too. And the IRS logs it under the name and taxpayer identification number shown on that 1099. And then their computers are watching that person's tax return to make sure that that person is reporting all of their income. That's the 40,000 foot view, maybe even a little further. That might be the 10,000 foot view. Someday we'll go into a ground level view of this, but that's good enough for today, I think, is that it's tax compliance. So then we have to look at the concept of beneficial owners. And in the context of information returns, a beneficial owner is who is reporting the income off of that 1099 on a tax return. Now, that could be very straightforward. The vendor that you're paying is who you put on the 1099, but not always. And especially not when you're dealing with LLCs with one owner. Single member LLCs is the technical term, who are taxed as disregarded entities. Now, what does that mean? Well, disregarded entity means you are ignoring the existence of the entity. So you ignore the existence of the LLC. That's the default income tax treatment for an LLC with one owner. And if that one owner is a human, that means you're disregarding the LLC and looking at the owner of the LLC. That's the beneficial owner of the income that you're paying the LLC. So now we start putting the puzzle pieces together. That means you need to issue a 1099 in the name and taxpayer ID number of that beneficial owner. And that's where the problems arise when you have these single member LLCs taxed as disregarded entities. So the W-9 instructions currently say several things about single member LLCs that are taxed as disregarded entities. And it's pretty clear what to do. The problem is who reads the instructions, right? No one looks at the instructions. But if you do look at the instructions, it's actually quite informative. So line 1 of the W-9 is where the name goes. And in this circumstance, it would be the beneficial owner of the income goes on line 1. And here we don't even have to look at the instructions. You can breathe a big sigh of relief about that, or your vendor can, because they don't have to look at the instructions. It's printed right on line 1. It says for a sole, this is a quote, for a sole proprietor or disregarded entity, enter the owner's name on line 1 and enter the business or disregarded entity's name on line 2. Now, there could be some confusion, where people are like, what's a disregarded entity? But I think most of the time, your vendor will probably get that part right. But then you get to the taxpayer identification number part, the TIN part of the W-9. That's really where it's at for the problems. The words printed on the form do say the TIN should match whoever or whatever is shown on line 1. Unfortunately, the rest of the words are not exactly clear, and the words say, among other things, disregarded entities should see the instructions to part 1. Which, what a drag. Who wants to dig through the instructions? So this is why a lot of the times with these single member LLCs taxed as sole proprietorships, they just put the LLC's EIN here. But that's wrong. If you do look at the instructions, it's on page 4, right-hand column, halfway down. Quote, if you are a single member LLC that is disregarded as an entity separate from its owner, enter the owner's social security number or EIN if the owner has one. We'll come back to that in just a second, that whole if the owner has one. And then there's a chart on page 5 of the instructions that also lays it out, that disregarded entities owned by an individual should give you the social security number of the owner or an EIN if the owner has one. So that means if the EIN is in the name of that owner personally, they can use it. And it is possible that an individual can have an EIN in their name, but it shouldn't be the LLC's EIN. That's in the instructions. Now, when I teach on this subject, people argue with me as though I'm misinterpreting something. In particular, when I'm talking to groups of accountants, I get a lot of pushback on this. I've had people tell me to my face, you're wrong. I have literally gotten hate email from people on this subject telling me I'm wrong. But the thing is, there's nothing open to interpretation here. It's in the instructions. I'm not trying to be edgy here or controversial. This is in the instructions, and it's not new. This isn't me looking at something and saying, oh, I have a different way of looking at this. This is how it is. Now, One thing that several people have said to me recently is, well, I formed an LLC so I wouldn't have to give my social security number. Or an accountant will say to me, well, my clients formed an LLC so they wouldn't have to give their social security number. And my response is, yeah, I'm sure that's true. But it doesn't change what the instructions say. I also would agree with those of you who would say, why can't the IRS just do computer matching where they tie the LLC's EIN to the name of the individual? I don't know. You'd have to ask that question of the IRS. Sounds like a good idea to me, but that's not how it is. The way it is anyone checking individual sole proprietor, which would include LLCs with one owner, can give you their social security number or their own EIN if it's in their name personally. The LLC's EIN shouldn't be used. That's not new. It's how it's always been. Now, there's this draft out there of a new W-9 that says anyone checking individual sole proprietor must give their social security number, no EINs allowed, and that is actually printed right on the W-9, so no one has to even look at the instructions to see that. However, that's just a draft. As of now, we don't know when or if it'll actually be released for real. So that'll do it for this week's episode of Information Return Intelligence. I'm Jason Dinesen. Thanks for joining us, and we'll talk to you again next week.